I just want people to know that my father was a person. He had a beating heart. His murder affected everything that happened in my life after that. Everything.
It clearly was a very, very violent scene, and nobody deserved to die that way.
People don't know how to forgive. When someone becomes obsessed with what to do with how they feel, the negative emotion that they feel, it becomes anger, it becomes rage.
I was not going to let that go about what happened to my father because I couldn't move on. What you do in the dark will always come to the light, always.
February 27th, 1995, Baltimore, Maryland. It's early afternoon when a cable TV technician goes to the home of a new customer.
When the cable technician showed up, the door was open. She let herself in. And she wished that she hadn't. She saw that there was a man on the couch inside the apartment who was slumped over. She feared that he was dead. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, on his body.
The technician rushes to call 911.
And shortly thereafter, the EMTs and police showed up to the scene. It was immediately clear to EMTs that this victim had suffered severe injuries which ended his life. His head had been brutally smashed in with blood and brain matter everywhere. They actually couldn't tell if the damage was as a result of blunt force trauma or a gunshot wound.
When the police enter the apartment, they're able to do a quick scan and they find his wallet. And with that, they were able to confirm that the victim was in fact Leroy Lincoln Sr.
Leroy Lincoln Sr. was born in Baltimore, Maryland.
He was raised on Holland Street, which is in South Baltimore, known as Pigtown. He did have 2 other brothers, and he had 2 other sisters. He had somewhat of a strict background as well. His mother was a Jehovah's Witness, and she did her best to bring up her kids as witnesses as well. Some of them stayed with the religion, and some of them strayed with it. My father was one that was kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Leroy was known as someone who was fun. He was fun-loving, he laughed, he played, he joked. The people who knew Leroy and spent time with him really enjoyed being around him.
In the 1960s, Leroy's easygoing charm and quick wit caught the attention of a woman named Geraldine Parks.
My mother, she's from Trap Hill, North Carolina. She is also one of a large family. She was raised in the country where you're waking up with roosters crowing. Totally different than my father's background. He was born in the city.
Geraldine had been married as a teenager, but that relationship ended shortly after the birth of her daughter. When she met Leroy on a trip to Baltimore, she saw a chance to make a fresh start.
She wanted to be free. She wanted to experience life. At the time, she did have 1 child, but she just wanted to get away. And my father kind of represented an exciting life in Baltimore. My mother told me that she loved the way my father made her laugh. He was a natural comedian, and she was looking for a good laugh, someone that could make her feel a certain way, and he fulfilled that. So she moved to Baltimore to be with him, but she found out she was also pregnant by him, which led to my other sister being born.
Over the next decade, Leroy and Geraldine's family continued to grow.
I have 2 older sisters, then it's me, and then I have 2 younger sisters and 2 younger brothers.
Leroy and Geraldine, they had the American dream. Everything was good for them. They built a life together, with Leroy having a job at the MTA and Geraldine being at home with the kids.
Leroy continued to stray from some of the teachings of his Jehovah's Witness faith. And at first, Geraldine was all for it.
They used to be the party house, how much fun they used to have. Everybody from the neighborhood would be there. They used to have a great time.
There was always alcohol flowing, weed in the background. This was back in the 70s. It was just live. We had the party house.
Then, in the late 70s, the Lincoln family suffered a tragedy that would change all of their lives.
When Geraldine gave birth to their 7th child, the child was born, stillborn, and that really devastated her.
My mother went into this deep depression. She saw no way out. My father's mother pulled my mother to the side and told her, "You know you're gonna see him again one day." And she started telling her about the promise of a new order, the promise of a resurrection. Once you turn your life over to Jehovah, your loved ones will be brought back to life. And my mother held fast to that deeply. She started going to the hall, started dedicating her life to Jehovah, becoming a Jehovah's Witness. And she gave my father the ultimatum: this is what you're gonna have to do, otherwise we can't be together. And my father loved her, he wanted to be with her. My father kind of got back into it, and they realized that they felt like they were living in sin. So they both got baptized and they got married and started living their lives as Jehovah's Witnesses.
Her dad was more of the laid-back kind of guy. I think he didn't really care so much about the faith. But for her mom, it was everything. And it ruled their household. Can't do this, you can't do that. You can't associate with this person or that one.
We went from being a party house to every Sundays, every Tuesdays, every Thursdays, we in the Kingdom Hall. We couldn't drink no more. You can't be around people that's smoking no more.
This was a challenge for Leroy. He was doing this for her, and he wasn't quite ready to adjust at the speed that she was.
Things started becoming challenging. My father wasn't having that no more. He was not having it anymore. My father had a problem with smoking cigarettes. He couldn't stop smoking. So they kicked him out of the hall because of that. They kicked him out of the religion.
While smoking was prohibited, divorce was also forbidden. So Geraldine tried to keep the marriage going, but still followed the religion's rules of disfellowshipped former members.
When you're disfellowshipped in the Jehovah's Witness congregation, you're basically shunned. Nobody can talk to you. If they talk to you, then they're gonna be shunned as well. My mother couldn't speak to him no more. We as kids couldn't even speak to him anymore. He lives in the same house. We can't say, "Hi, Daddy, what you want for breakfast?" None of that.
I think he just felt alienated. He did feel like a stranger in his own house.
I can imagine that must have sent him into a really, really dark place, which wouldn't have helped his addiction to alcohol and cigarettes.
According to his loved ones, Leroy turned to other vices as well.
He was unable to get his needs met, intimacy, closeness, all of those things were removed from him. And so he started to seek for those things elsewhere. Leroy was in and out of different relationships with other women, cheating. He would leave the house and eventually come back.
I think it took Geraldine so long to consider divorce is because it is a huge sin in most faiths and most religions to get a divorce. I think that was probably her last resort.
In January 1995, the couple realized they've had enough, despite Geraldine's faith. She kept their children and their home, and Leroy moved into an apartment.
I think Tia's dad wanted his family. It seems like he was a good father. I always felt that he still tried to maintain relationships with his kids.
Now, 1 month after he moved out, Leroy is dead at just 51 years old, and Baltimore police want to know why, and if his lifestyle had something to do with it.
Once my father left the Jehovah's Witness religion, he started doing his own thing. He got another girlfriend. He got with friends who did drugs. He started smoking weed. That weed led to other drugs. Jehovah's Witnesses will call it the wrong crowd. And they will say that he started hanging with people who Well, there was a scripture, 1 Corinthians 15:33. Basically, that was drilled in our heads that bad associations spoil useful habits.
"51-year-old Leroy Lincoln Sr. has been found murdered in his apartment, and authorities are looking for clues. The damage to his skull is so severe, they can't even tell yet if he was shot or beaten to death."
Because the victim's wallet and cash were still there and there were no signs of forced entry, detectives ruled out burglary as a possible motive for the murder.
And there was no murder weapon at the scene. They didn't find any fingerprints, they didn't find any DNA, everything was spotless.
Detectives do find something else, however.
There was drug paraphernalia that was found in the home. There was crack cocaine.
They find a pipe and they also find a partially smoked joint.
The police went around to ask questions of the neighbors, but he lived in the hood in Baltimore, so nobody saw anything.
That's not uncommon for people to really not want to get involved or say anything to the police. However, one neighbor does recall hearing some strange things the night before. It sounded like someone was knocking on Leroy's door late the other night. Shortly after he heard the knocking, he heard the TV come on, and then he heard some type of commotion happening. At the time, he didn't think much of it. He thought maybe Leroy's just a night owl, but now he's having thoughts of whether or not he heard the murder.
Unfortunately, Leroy's neighbor couldn't provide any useful details. To investigators, the drug paraphernalia suggests a scenario that's become all too common in the area.
In the 1990s, Baltimore was really known for high crime rates. In fact, it was higher than the national average. Baltimore was averaging about 300 murders a year in the 90s.
Many of the crimes were shootings, fueled by a cycle of revenge.
They were drug shootings. You sold on my turf. You killed my brother. You killed someone in my family. You stole my drug pipeline. It's a never ending in that manner until we find a way to solve the drug problem.
Leroy's murder is the 44th in Baltimore that year, and it's only the end of February. His daughter, Tia, learns about it that evening.
I was doing laundry, watching the news like I always do. The headline of the news was there was a homicide in East Northern Parkway. And they said the victim was a former MTA bus driver. I was like, what? So I stopped what I was doing and I called my father's phone. No answer, no answer, no answer. I'm blowing it up, no answer.
When someone does finally answer Leroy's phone, it's a homicide detective.
And I said, look, is my father there? Is my father there? What is going on? He said that my father was killed. I lost it. I fell to the floor, I screamed, I cried, and all of that. When I got myself together, I asked him, I said, are you sure, was this like a mistake? I said, look, my father had no enemies. He was a jokester. He don't go around robbing drug dealers. He don't go around beating people up. I was just trying to digest the fact that he had just been murdered. I didn't immediately think that it was anybody. I was just like, who would do it?
Investigators are asking the same question. And now that they are in contact with family, they speak with more loved ones. They begin with Geraldine.
She denied actually being there or obviously laying a finger on him.
She swore that she had nothing to do with his murder and that she was home with her daughter that night.
However, she admits she's never forgiven Leroy for his shortcomings.
She let detectives know that they were going through a divorce and that he had cheated on her multiple times and that they were not in a good place with each other. Geraldine disclosed to police that Leroy had been smoking crack for years and that this was one of the key points that caused their separation. She wouldn't be surprised that some of the drug connections that he has is probably the cause of his murder. She claimed that it was possible that one of the women that he had cheated with was responsible, or one of the boyfriends or husbands of those women could have been responsible for his murder. The police also speak to the couple's 18-year-old son, who was still living at the house with his mother. Leroy Lincoln Jr. confirms the story about his father's drug addiction. He also has an alibi for the night of the murder.
Authorities hope the autopsy will reveal a fresh avenue of investigation.
The medical examiner's autopsy report sheds a little more light on the case. They determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma. The beating was so severe that it had shattered Leroy's skull into pieces. Whoever killed him seemed to take out a lot of pent-up rage. Given the past stories of drug problems with Leroy Lincoln Sr., it is not out of the question that someone who he had been involved with in that life is responsible for his murder. Unfortunately, investigators have no suspects in the case.
Tia worries her father's murder will become another unsolved case in a city overwhelmed with violent crime.
To be honest with you, in the city of Baltimore, you lose a family member, that's it. Investigations, 50% of them are not even solved. I was expected to just pick up and just move forward and live my life. But after he was killed, we had to plan a funeral.
Leroy was quite a beloved member of his community and was very well liked by many people around the city. But people noticed that not everyone is upset about his murder.
When friends and loved ones gather at the funeral of Leroy Lincoln Sr., it quickly becomes clear that Leroy's widow, Geraldine, still bears a grudge.
My mother insisted that that casket stay open. She wanted everybody to see what had happened to him. The funeral director said the only way we can do this open casket, somebody gotta buy him a hat or something because there's no head here. So my fiance went to the store and bought him a skull cap.
The funeral home actually has to ask a pastor who was there for another funeral to come over and lead the celebration for Leroy's life.
But my mother deliberately told the officiant that she didn't want anybody to speak over him. She didn't want anybody to say anything nice about him. I was sitting there in tears like, this is really going down like this? After the viewing, my mother decided that my father was going to be cremated as soon as possible. She didn't want a tombstone or anything like that. She didn't care what they did with his ashes. She told them to flush him down the toilet. To this day, I don't know where they are. My father doesn't have a tombstone. Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in going to grave sites like that anyway, but I always wanted that to do, at least for Father's Day or birthday or something, but nothing. I kind of do regret not speaking up on requesting his ashes because he deserved better than that.
To Tia Lincoln, her mother's behavior isn't just strange, it's suspicious.
I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but I was trying to swallow that away, trying to ignore it.
But Geraldine's actions are difficult to ignore.
About a week after Leroy Sr.'s murder, Geraldine moves back to North Carolina with her daughter and her son, Leroy Jr. This is odd because she had just moved into the home about a month ago.
Her lease wasn't up or anything, and she just left so quickly after he was murdered. Why did that happen?
As the months pass, Tia is increasingly bothered by her mother's actions and inaction.
Why did you not ever call the police to try to investigate, to figure out what happened to him? I understand y'all were going through a divorce, but damn, nothing? She never did any of that?
Unfortunately, Tia seems to be the only member of the family still interested in pursuing the case, and detectives are unable to find any proof of her suspicions.
There was no forensic evidence developed in this case. DNA only occurs mainly if someone spits on you or has sex with you. This is not the type of case.
It was a low probability of the case ever being solved. After about a year, the police department shelved the case, and eventually it was considered an unsolved murder, then transitioned into a cold case.
That pissed me off, and that's when I was just like, look, something got to be done. Otherwise, I can't move on with my life.
She was really very sad and heartbroken about her father's death. It wasn't as a thing where you could see her going in the corner and crying. It was more like, yo, I want to know what happened to my dad.
She didn't want to accept what police had to say, and she was really frustrated with Baltimore police.
I had to figure out what had happened to my father. So after I got myself together and I started playing things in my head, I wanted the detectives to conduct a thorough investigation, and that means questioning everybody in his family, including my mother, Geraldine.
When the anniversary of Leroy Lincoln Sr.'s murder passes without any new leads, his daughter, Tia Lincoln, decides to act.
After it seemed like nothing was being done, a year later, I started to investigate the case on my own. I didn't have money to hire an investigator. I started talking to his friends, trying to see if he had any enemies. I started talking to his former girlfriends to see if they had any hidden agendas or vendettas against him or anything like that. Everything just kept leading back to a feeling that I kept trying to swallow, kept trying to ignore. It just kept coming back to mama, maybe she had something to do with it.
The first red flag was Geraldine's handling of Leroy's funeral and her abrupt move back to North Carolina. The second comes when she returns to collect his insurance money.
When my father was killed, even though they were going through a nasty, bitter divorce, she was still technically the beneficiary on his life insurance policies. She broke her neck to come up here to get his life insurance because the checks came to my house, but she wouldn't come up here for any other reason. That seemed suspicious. I think they only came up to about $60,000, and she was like, where's the rest? Where's the rest? She was extremely pissed off about that. What happened was, we didn't find this out till later, he had stopped paying on it, so they had canceled that particular policy.
Geraldine also cautions Tia to stop bothering the police with her inquiries into Leroy Sr.'s murder. She says that Leroy was a dirtbag and deserved to get whatever he got.
I think her mom's hostility and this resentment that never showing sympathy or remorse about what happened to him, it created a bigger suspicion.
That suspicion ultimately unlocks a crucial memory Tia first thought was a joke.
We were raised to believe that Daddy does not care about us. Daddy cares about his drugs more than he cares about us. He cares about his other girlfriends more than he cares about us. So we grew up with huge animosity towards him. My mother would always constantly, these weren't jokes. I just wish somebody would take him out.
She remembered hearing her mother say that she wished that someone would kill Leroy Sr.
My father only had one person that hated him, hated his entire being, and that was my mother.
Tia summons the strength to confront her mother.
I flat out asked her, did you have anything to do with it? And of course she denied it. She said no, and she was really insistent this time, look, get over it, stop asking me that, move on.
Tia doesn't give up, but instead digs deeper. She doesn't think her mother would beat Leroy Sr. to death on her own.
I thought that if she was involved, who would she get to do her killing? One of the people that she would have had to recruit to do this would have had to been my brother Leroy Jr. And the reason why I say that is because they were close. I was going off of a hunch. I didn't know for sure.
A hunch isn't enough for Baltimore investigators to act on. And years continue to pass with no movement on the case.
After 7 years, I finally came up with a plan to get the detectives to, at the very least, question somebody.
She got to a place of desperation where she didn't see any way out, and she needed answers. So she decided to do the only thing that she thought she could do.
I knew that at the time that my brother had a girlfriend who had a drug problem, and I also knew that she had been in and out of jail. So I was gonna play like I was her. So I went to a payphone, I called the detectives, disguised my voice, and told them that I had information about an unsolved homicide. They were like, well, what information do you want to provide? And I said, my boyfriend did it. I said, he came in the house and he said he killed his father. He had blood on his clothes. I said that, I was dying of AIDS. I wanted to clear my conscience. I didn't leave a name though.
That was a huge, huge risk. But it did pay off. It forced the police department to take her father's case seriously. Had Tia not made that call, she would have never found out what happened to her dad.
Acting on Tia Lincoln's false tip about the murder of her father, Leroy Lincoln Sr., authorities tracked down Leroy Jr.'s former girlfriend.
Detectives go right over there, but she seems surprised to see them. She says that she never made that call, but the details of the call are actually true. She tells police that she did overhear a conversation between her then boyfriend, Leroy Jr., and his mother, Geraldine Lincoln. They were discussing having Leroy Sr. murdered.
The girlfriend's story about the night Leroy Sr. was killed actually matches a detail Tia had made up when she called investigators and reveals a third conspirator.
She said that my brother came in the house with blood on his clothes and confessed to killing his father with his friend John.
Leroy Jr., he had a best friend named John Cross, who he grew up with, and John came with a pretty lengthy criminal record himself. So it makes sense that if Leroy was going to do something like this, he would definitely bring someone like John along with him.
For the first time in 7 years, Baltimore police have a solid lead. They ask North Carolina police to pick up Geraldine Lincoln and her son Leroy Jr. and hold them for questioning. And locally, they begin searching for Leroy Jr.'s alleged accomplice.
He was serving time away on a burglary charge. They went to his cell and everything, and they questioned him about a murder. He was like, I don't know none of them. I don't know nothing about anything.
After getting nothing from John Cross, detectives traveled to North Carolina to interview Geraldine and Leroy Jr.
When they accuse her of being the mastermind behind her husband's murder, she denies having anything to do with it. What she does say is that it doesn't matter who killed her husband because he deserved it.
The detective said she went into a 6-minute rant of how bad he was. He was this, he was that, he was disgusting, he was blah, blah, blah.
The way Geraldine Lincoln described her husband was not pleasant. I believe he used drugs. He may have used drugs in the presence of his children. I do know there are allegations that he molested his daughters.
According to Geraldine, what happened to him was payback for all of the pain that he inflicted on others.
But who delivered that payback? Investigators turn up the pressure by showing Geraldine 3 incriminating photos.
The first is a photo of Leroy Jr. The caption reads, "That's Junior, whose father he and I killed for Miss Jolene." It's signed John Cross. The second photo is of John Cross, and this one too has a caption. This is John. Junior said he hit Junior's father over the head while they smoked weed. This photo seemed to be signed by Junior's girlfriend. The third photo is of Jolene, and on the back of this photo it says, "This is Miss Jolene. She set up the murder of Junior's dad." It was dated the same date as the photos that were signed by John Cross.
There was a little bit of deception because they were not written by the actual witnesses or suspects. They were written by the detective. That said, what they wrote were facts that were already proven by the investigation so far.
The ruse works. After years of denial, Geraldine finally breaks.
When confronted with those photos, Geraldine Lincoln eventually admitted that she wanted her husband, decedent Leroy Lincoln Sr., murdered, and admitted a degree of participation in that she wanted him dead.
She's like, yeah, I knew about the murder. Yeah, I knew that they killed him. Yeah, they got the axe out of my house. She said, well, how is that a crime? What did I do wrong? Just because I didn't say anything? Just because I didn't stop them? And just because I talked about it for years and pumped their heads up to do it, I didn't do anything wrong.
She was charged with first-degree murder because she wanted it to happen, planned it, and solicited people to do it. She was also charged with conspiracy.
Investigators try the same approach with Leroy Jr., but he doesn't take the bait.
The game that the detectives played failed. Even after seeing the photos, he still denied that he had anything to do with his father's death. But then the investigators tried their last trick. They got a tape recorder and played parts of their interview with Leroy's mother. Those clips had been edited to make it sound like Jolene had implicated her son in the murder of his father.
Once they played him that tape, he put his head on the table and was just like, all right, I'm gonna tell you everything you wanna know.
He claimed that he had been physically and psychologically abused by his father, and that his father would beat all of the children with extension cords and other things that he found around the house. Leroy Jr. even suggested that his father had forced him and his brother to sell crack cocaine. Leroy Jr. believed that his father had been trying to destroy their family for years, and that by February 1995, it was time for his father to pay for his evil deeds.
After helping his mother, Geraldine Lincoln, cover up the murder of his father for over 7 years, Leroy Lincoln Jr. is now ready to confess everything.
Leroy tells police that he, his mother, and John Cross had been plotting to kill his father for months. The night of the murder, Leroy Jr. said that he and John met at Jolene's house. They got the handle from an axe that she had lying around, and they went over to Leroy Sr.'s house. When they got there, they knocked on the door, and Sr. let them in. They led him to believe that they were there to smoke marijuana and watch TV with him.
They were sitting there drinking and smoking one minute, and he said that he looked over at John. They made eye contact, and he said that John had acted like he was gonna go to the bathroom or something, and he could see out of the corner of his eye that John had the axe like this. And he said he hit my father with the axe.
Leroy Jr. says that after the murder was completed, that John sat his father's body back on the couch, and they left. But obviously they hadn't closed the door on their way out. Leroy Jr. says that he dropped John off at his house before he went back to his own home, where he told his girlfriend what had happened.
Geraldine Lincoln, Leroy Lincoln Jr., and John Cross are all charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder.
In late 2003, Leroy Jr. is the first to be tried in his father's murder. The prosecution's case is depending upon the testimony of his ex-girlfriend and his own taped confession. The defense team argues that Leroy Jr. never had anything to do with his father's murder and that his confession was coerced. They painted Leroy Sr. as an evil man who was addicted to drugs, who forced his children to sell drugs, and who was physically, mentally, and sometimes sexually abusive.
But there is no evidence whatsoever to prove Leroy Sr. was abusive.
I'm just gonna say, look, he never touched me. He never acted like he wanted to touch me. I mean, he never looked at me like he wanted to touch me. But that rumor was spread throughout our family, and that was part of the reasons why we were groomed to hate him.
Tia takes the stand for the prosecution.
Tia Lincoln.
And do you have a brother named Leroy Lincoln?
Yes.
What, if anything, did the defendant, Leroy Lincoln Jr., say he wanted to do to his father, your father?
He didn't say, okay, I want to kill him. You know, it was more so of him being around, you know, when the conversations were being talked about, you know, as far as my mother, and I can't remember him specifically saying, okay, well, I want to kill him, you know.
The defense tries to pin the murder on Geraldine, arguing only she wanted Leroy Sr. dead.
How many times would you say altogether your mother brought up the same subject, wanting to get the father out of the way, be nice to get the money, get him out of my life, get to myself, whatever she was saying? How many different times did that same tape come up?
Over 15.
Over 50 times?
Over 50.
On September 25th, 2003, the jury reaches a verdict.
They find Leroy Lincoln Jr. guilty of the conspiracy to commit murder, but they acquit him of the first-degree murder charge. He's sentenced to life in prison with all but 25 years suspended.
I mean, my brother, he had no remorse from it. He was not sorry for it. I even asked him that, are you sorry? Do you regret it? No, not at all.
A week later, Geraldine opts for a bench trial, which means she only faces a judge, not a jury.
She was charged with first-degree murder, even though she didn't lay a finger on the victim. I had to know I had to dot all the I's, cross all the T's. I had to put on all those witnesses who heard them planning and talking about and wanting to kill Leroy Lincoln Sr. There's no direct evidence. No one saw her do it. No one said, please kill him, I'll pay you. But there was enough there to convict her of a conspiracy.
The court agrees. And on October 1st, 2003, Geraldine is found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Like her son, she receives a life sentence. But the 2004 trial for their alleged co-conspirator, John Cross, yields a much different result.
Unfortunately, he was found not guilty by a city jury in Baltimore.
John was acquitted because, again, he had an excellent attorney, and also there was no physical evidence linking him to that crime, and also without eyewitness testimony of one of the murderers that was there was no case. He walked. Haven't heard from him since.
It was a cold case, which already has a high degree of difficulty in steering convictions. I'm still unhappy with the fact that we did not bring Mr. Cross to justice.
After just 8 years in prison, Geraldine is released on parole. 2 years after that, Leroy Jr. is also released.
Revenge is never worth it. Both people suffer, the person who's killed and the person who killed them.
The fact that she would go to such an extent to get rid of.
I still remember the fear that spread across Yorkshire in the winter of 2005. It was not the kind of fear created by a single terrible event that fades after a few days. It was a fear that lingered in quiet villages, empty country roads, and isolated farmhouses, growing stronger every time another body was discovered. Elderly couples checked every lock before going to bed. Farmers glanced over their shoulders while walking across silent fields. Families who had never imagined danger could reach their front doors began leaving lights on throughout the night. Somewhere in the countryside, police believed a desperate fugitive was moving from village to village, surviving one day at a time while leaving tragedy behind him. At first, the killings did not appear to belong to the same story. Different victims, different locations, different circumstances. Yet experienced detectives noticed small patterns hidden beneath the surface. The attacks were sudden. The offender appeared comfortable moving through remote rural areas. Food often disappeared alongside other stolen items. The violence seemed driven not by profit alone but by an overwhelming determination to eliminate anyone who might stand in his way. As the investigation expanded, the map of Yorkshire slowly transformed into something investigators dreaded seeing. Coloured pins marking crime scenes began forming an unsettling trail across North and West Yorkshire. Every new discovery forced detectives to ask the same question. Was this a man carefully planning each murder, or someone whose life had descended into complete chaos, making every unexpected encounter potentially fatal? The answer, when it finally emerged, shocked even seasoned investigators. The suspect was not an unknown predator who had appeared out of nowhere. He was a man already familiar to police. A man whose life had been marked by violence long before he became a killer. A man who believed the world had wronged him since childhood, carrying decades of resentment that eventually erupted into revenge before spiraling into an even darker series of crimes. His name was Mark Hobson. Long before newspapers printed his photograph across their front pages, before helicopters searched forests and police dogs combed muddy fields, Mark Hobson had been another troubled child growing up in northern England. His early years were shaped by instability, abuse, and repeated encounters with authority. Those experiences would later become central to discussions surrounding the case. Psychologists, journalists, and criminologists would spend years examining whether his upbringing explained the path he followed. The courts ultimately reached a different conclusion. Pain may explain parts of a person's history. It does not excuse the choices they make. That distinction became one of the defining themes of the case. Because while many children endure abuse and grow into compassionate adults determined to break the cycle, Mark Hobson chose another direction entirely. Investigators would eventually conclude that his crimes reflected decisions made over months, not uncontrollable moments of panic. Revenge evolved into survival. Survival evolved into repeated violence. Each decision narrowed every possible route back until there was only one ending left. The investigation itself became one of Britain's most significant manhunts of the time. Hundreds of officers joined the search. Specialist search teams crossed dense woodland. Roadblocks appeared throughout rural communities. Residents were urged to remain vigilant but avoid taking unnecessary risks. Every reported sighting generated fresh hope. Most led nowhere. The uncertainty proved almost as frightening as the confirmed facts. No one knew exactly where the fugitive would appear next. His movements seemed unpredictable, yet detectives believed he was constantly searching for shelter, food, and isolation. Every abandoned building, every quiet lane, every farmhouse standing alone against the cold Yorkshire landscape suddenly carried an unsettling possibility. For the families of the victims, however, the investigation was never about headlines or police operations. It was about empty chairs around kitchen tables. Telephone calls that would never come. Birthdays forever marked by absence instead of celebration. Every photograph left behind became a reminder that the people they loved had ordinary plans for tomorrow that would never be fulfilled. Those losses are the true center of this story. Not the man responsible for them. Because every notorious criminal case risks becoming remembered only through the name of the offender. The victims become supporting characters in their own tragedy. Their lives shrink into brief descriptions attached to crime scene reports. This story deserves a different approach. It begins not with the pursuit of a killer, but with the lives forever interrupted by his actions. It examines the warning signs that appeared years before the murders. It follows the investigators who refused to stop searching despite difficult terrain and mounting pressure. It explores how forensic science, witness testimony, and determined police work gradually close the distance between a fugitive and the officers trying to find him. And finally, it asks one of the most difficult questions any true crime story can raise. How does a child who grows up surrounded by violence become an adult capable of inflicting unimaginable suffering on others? The answer is neither simple nor comfortable. It cannot be reduced to a single traumatic event, a single diagnosis, or a single bad decision. Instead, it lies somewhere within a complicated intersection of personal responsibility, untreated problems, repeated criminal behavior, substance abuse, and choices made over decades. Understanding those factors does not lessen the horror experienced by the victims. If anything, it highlights how many opportunities existed before lives were lost. This is the story of a community living under the shadow of uncertainty. The story of investigators racing against time before another family received devastating news. The story of victims whose names deserve to be remembered with dignity. And it is the story of Mark Hobson, a man whose search for revenge became a chain of irreversible decisions that ended with one of the harshest sentences available under British law, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life behind prison walls. Before that final judgment, however, there were years of conflict, warning signs that few fully understood, and a sequence of events that transformed one man's long-held resentment into a case that would leave a lasting mark on Yorkshire and on British criminal history. In the chapters that follow, we will begin where every investigation truly begins, not at the crime scene, but years earlier, inside a troubled home where the first fractures in this tragic story quietly appeared. The Yorkshire countryside has long carried an image of quiet permanence. Rolling green hills stretch toward distant stone villages. Narrow country roads wind between ancient dry stone walls. Sheep graze peacefully beneath broad skies that seem to change with every passing hour. It is a landscape that has inspired novels, paintings, and generations of families who believed that life there moved at a slower, safer rhythm than in Britain's crowded cities. But every place, no matter how peaceful it appears, holds stories that challenge its image. By the beginning of 2005, winter had settled heavily across northern England. The trees stood stripped bare, their branches clawing at grey skies. Morning frost clung stubbornly to fields until well after sunrise. Thick patches of fog drifted across country lanes, reducing visibility to only a few yards. The early darkness of January arrived before many people had finished work, leaving villages wrapped in silence long before bedtime. For most residents, those were ordinary seasonal changes. For detectives, they created the perfect conditions for someone trying to disappear. The countryside that tourists admired during summer became an endless maze of woodland, abandoned farm buildings, isolated cottages, and winding roads known only to local residents. A person determined to avoid capture could travel remarkable distances without attracting attention. A single forgotten barn could provide shelter for days. Small streams supplied water. Fields offered countless routes that never appeared on main roads. As police would later discover, someone was taking advantage of exactly that. The first reports arriving at police stations did not immediately suggest the beginning of a larger nightmare. Rural police officers are accustomed to investigating isolated incidents. Violence in the countryside often appears disconnected simply because communities are spread so far apart. An assault in one village may have no connection whatsoever to an incident 20 miles away. That assumption would slowly begin to crumble. Each new investigation introduced another disturbing coincidence. Another victim. Another remote location. Another attack marked by extraordinary violence. Another trail that disappeared into the countryside. Detectives remained cautious. Linking cases too early can damage an investigation just as easily as overlooking connections. Every crime scene had to be examined independently. Every witness interviewed without assumptions. Every forensic sample documented with meticulous care. Yet an uncomfortable feeling continued to grow inside the investigation teams. Someone, somewhere, was moving through Yorkshire. Someone who appeared increasingly desperate. Someone who left behind grief wherever he went. The fear spread more quickly than official announcements ever could. Small communities communicate in ways impossible to measure. News travels through conversations outside village shops, local pubs, church gatherings, school gates, and neighborhood phone calls. Long before national newspapers devoted front pages to the investigation, residents had already begun sharing warnings among themselves. Keep your doors locked. Don't answer the door after dark unless you know who's there. Call the police if you notice anyone wandering near isolated properties. The advice sounded almost surreal to people who had spent decades living without serious concern for personal safety. Many older residents had developed habits that reflected another era. Front doors remained unlocked during daylight. Neighbors entered one another's homes without formal invitations. Cars were left with keys inside while gates were opened. Those customs had survived for generations because trust had survived alongside them. Now that trust was beginning to disappear. Police patrol vehicles became an increasingly common sight on roads where seeing an officer had once been unusual. Helicopters occasionally broke the silence overhead. Search teams crossed farmland with dogs trained to follow even the faintest scent. Every search raised expectations. Every unsuccessful search deepened frustration. For the officers involved, the pressure was relentless. Each passing day carried the possibility that another innocent person might encounter the fugitive before police did. Investigators understood something the public could only imagine. A person living as a wanted murderer experiences the world differently. Every stranger becomes a possible threat. Every passing vehicle appears suspicious. Every unexpected encounter carries the risk of recognition. That constant paranoia can make behavior dangerously unpredictable. The offender they were pursuing was no longer simply escaping justice. He was surviving from one day to the next. And survival, when combined with fear and violence, can produce devastating consequences. Meanwhile, journalists from across Britain arrived in Yorkshire. Satellite vans parked outside police headquarters. Television crews filmed quiet village streets that had suddenly become national news. Reporters interviewed local residents standing beside stone walls and frozen fields, asking the same questions everyone wanted answered. Who was responsible? Where was he hiding? Would he strike again? Police, however, released only carefully controlled information. Investigations depend as much upon protecting evidence as collecting it. Revealing too much could alert the suspect. Revealing too little risked increasing public anxiety. Balancing those responsibilities became one of the investigation's greatest challenges. Behind closed doors, detectives worked through enormous volumes of information. Witness statements filled shelves. Maps covered entire walls. Photographs documented every recovered piece of evidence. Telephone records, criminal histories, vehicle sightings, and forensic reports slowly accumulated into thousands of pages. Each investigator hoped that somewhere inside those documents existed the one overlooked detail capable of changing everything. Sometimes major cases are solved through dramatic discoveries. More often, they are solved because someone refuses to ignore a tiny inconsistency. A footprint that should not be there. A witness who remembers one additional detail. A receipt recovered from an abandoned building. A DNA sample waiting for laboratory confirmation. Piece by piece, investigations move forward. The public rarely sees that process. They see arrests. They see courtroom verdicts. They rarely witness the exhausting months spent eliminating possibilities one by one. As Yorkshire waited anxiously for answers, another story was beginning to emerge behind the scenes. Detectives examining the background of their primary suspect found a life that stretched back through decades of violence, addiction, imprisonment, and broken relationships. His criminal record was already extensive. His interactions with police were familiar. His personal history contained repeated episodes of aggression that had escalated over time. Yet none of those earlier offenses had prepared investigators for what would follow. Understanding the suspect required looking far beyond the crimes currently under investigation. It required returning to Leeds. Returning to a childhood marked by instability. Returning to a family where violence reportedly became an ordinary part of daily life. The picture that emerged was deeply troubling, but it also presented an important distinction. Many people experience traumatic childhoods. Very few become serial killers. That reality would remain central throughout every psychological assessment presented after his arrest. Experts would acknowledge years of reported abuse, substance misuse, and personality difficulties. They would also conclude that these factors could never erase personal responsibility for deliberate acts of murder. The victims had made no choices that justified what happened to them. Their lives intersected with a man who repeatedly chose violence. As investigators reconstructed his past, they discovered a pattern that seemed almost impossible to ignore. Conflict was rarely resolved peacefully. Resentment was rarely forgotten. Blame was almost always directed outward. Over time, those characteristics appeared to harden rather than diminish. By the time police began searching across Yorkshire in earnest, they were no longer looking only for a fugitive. They were searching for a man whose past and present had collided with devastating consequences. To understand how that transformation occurred, however, we must leave behind the search helicopters, police briefings, and newspaper headlines. We must travel back more than 3 decades, to the city of Leeds, where a young boy entered a household that those who knew the family would later describe as deeply troubled. It was there, long before the first victim lost his life, that the earliest chapters of this story quietly began to unfold. The story of Mark Hobson has often been reduced to a single sentence. A violent man with a violent past became a serial killer. It is a description that fits neatly into a headline, but it leaves behind the uncomfortable complexity that every major criminal investigation must confront. Human lives are rarely transformed by one moment alone. They are shaped over years by countless decisions, circumstances, opportunities, failures, and choices. Some of those influences can help explain a person's journey. None of them erase responsibility for the harm that person ultimately causes. This case has remained one of Britain's most disturbing modern criminal investigations, not simply because of the number of lives lost, but because it forced investigators, psychologists, journalists, and the public to wrestle with an enduring question that has no simple answer. When does a victim become an offender? More importantly, why do some people, despite enduring unimaginable hardship, choose lives of kindness while others descend into devastating violence? Those questions cannot be answered through speculation alone. They must be approached carefully, supported by evidence rather than assumption. As this story unfolds, we will examine documented events, court findings, witness accounts, and the investigative work that ultimately revealed what happened across Yorkshire between 2004 and 2005. Where uncertainty exists, we will acknowledge it. Where myths have grown around the case, we will separate them from the facts established through the criminal justice system. Because true crime is not about glorifying those who commit terrible acts. It is about understanding how such acts become possible, how investigators uncover the truth, and how society attempts to deliver justice afterward. In the years since Mark Hobson's conviction, one detail has repeatedly resurfaced whenever his name is mentioned. His childhood. Friends, relatives, journalists, and mental health professionals have all pointed toward the violence he reportedly experienced while growing up. Accounts presented during and after the investigation described years of abuse, instability, and neglect inside the family home. Those experiences undoubtedly left deep emotional scars. Yet the victims in this case had no role in creating that past. They did not know the fears he carried as a child. They were not responsible for the anger he nurtured for decades. Their lives intersected with his only because fate placed them in the wrong place at the wrong moment. That distinction deserves to remain clear from beginning to end. Throughout history, countless offenders have attempted to explain their crimes through suffering they endured earlier in life. Courts may consider those experiences when evaluating a person's background, but explanation is not exoneration. The legal system in England reached exactly that conclusion after carefully examining the evidence surrounding Mark Hobson's upbringing, his mental state, and his actions before, during, and after the murders. The judges concluded that he understood what he was doing. He made deliberate choices. He attempted to avoid capture. He continued offending over an extended period. Those findings would ultimately shape one of the harshest sentences available under British law. But that conclusion lay months away. Before the courtroom. Before the nationwide headlines. Before the helicopters circled above frozen forests. There were ordinary people living ordinary lives. An elderly man expecting another peaceful evening. A married couple growing old together in a quiet rural home. Individuals whose routines had changed very little over decades. They woke each morning expecting another familiar day. None of them could have imagined that their lives would become connected by the actions of someone they had never met. Their stories deserved to be remembered for more than the circumstances of their deaths. They were parents, neighbors, friends, members of close-knit communities where people still greeted each other by name and looked after one another during difficult times. Their absence would leave wounds that never fully healed. Children would lose parents. Neighbors would lose lifelong companions. Entire villages would lose part of the quiet confidence that had defined rural life for generations. Even years later, those communities would remember not only the crimes themselves but also the atmosphere that followed. The uncertainty. The unanswered questions. The hesitation before opening a front door after sunset. The unfamiliar habit of checking windows twice before bed. The realization that violence could reach places once considered immune from it. 4 police officers assigned to the investigation, every hour mattered. Each unsuccessful search increased the possibility of another encounter between the fugitive and an unsuspecting member of the public. Investigators worked under enormous pressure, knowing that every decision could influence whether someone else lived or died. They studied maps until late into the night. They coordinated searches across difficult terrain. They interviewed witnesses whose memories might contain a single overlooked detail capable of redirecting the investigation. They relied upon forensic scientists, search specialists, intelligence analysts, local officers, and countless members of the public who reported suspicious sightings. The eventual arrest of Mark Hobson was not the result of luck alone. It represented the combined efforts of hundreds of people who refused to allow the investigation to stall despite the immense challenges presented by rural Yorkshire in winter. This story belongs to them as much as anyone else. It belongs to the detectives who patiently assembled evidence piece by piece. It belongs to forensic experts whose scientific work connected crime scenes that initially appeared unrelated. It belongs to prosecutors who later presented that evidence before a jury. Most importantly, it belongs to the victims and their families, whose lives were permanently altered by events they neither anticipated nor deserved. As we begin this journey together, it is important to remember that true crime should never become entertainment at the expense of human suffering. Behind every police photograph stood a grieving family. Behind every courtroom exhibit stood a life interrupted. Behind every headline stood birthdays that would never again be celebrated together, conversations that ended without anyone realizing they would be the last, and homes that would forever feel incomplete. The names of offenders often become widely recognized. The names of victims deserve equal remembrance. That is the perspective this story will carry forward. Because although Mark Hobson became known throughout Britain as one of the country's most dangerous fugitives, the real story is not about building the legend of a killer. It is about understanding how investigators uncovered the truth, how justice was eventually achieved, and how communities struggled to recover after fear settled over the Yorkshire countryside. To understand how that fear began, however, we must leave behind the headlines of 2005 and travel back more than 30 years, to the industrial city of Leeds, where a young boy entered a household that relatives would later describe as deeply troubled. It was inside that home, amid instability, violence, and growing resentment, that the first chapter of this tragic case quietly began long before anyone could imagine the devastating consequences that would follow decades later. Long before Mark Hobson became the subject of one of Britain's most significant murder investigations, he was a child growing up in Leeds, West Yorkshire, during a period of considerable economic and social change. Like many industrial cities in northern England during the 1970s and 1980s, Leeds contained thriving neighbourhoods alongside communities facing unemployment, poverty, and social instability. For many families, daily life was shaped by financial pressure, changing industries, and limited access to support services that today are more widely recognised as important for vulnerable children. Against that broader backdrop, Mark Hobson's childhood has been described by relatives and later reports as deeply troubled. Accounts presented during the criminal proceedings and reported afterward indicated that his early years were marked by instability and repeated exposure to violence within the home. According to those accounts, his relationship with his stepfather, David Oakes, was characterized by frequent physical abuse and intimidation. Family members later described a household in which conflict and fear were recurring features rather than isolated incidents. It is important to note that such accounts help explain the environment in which Hobson grew up, but they do not excuse or justify the crimes for which he was later convicted. Many people endure traumatic childhoods without ever committing acts of violence. This distinction became a central theme during the legal proceedings and in later psychological discussions of the case. As a young boy, Hobson reportedly struggled to find stability. Rather than viewing home as a place of safety, it was described as a place he often tried to escape. Reports indicate that he ran away on multiple occasions, spending time away from the family home before eventually returning. These repeated attempts to leave reflected a pattern of instability that continued into adolescence. School offered little relief. Publicly available information suggests that Hobson experienced behavioral difficulties from an early age. His education was repeatedly disrupted, and he increasingly came to the attention of youth authorities. By his teenage years, he had accumulated a record of offending that included theft and other criminal behavior. These incidents marked the beginning of a long and persistent involvement with the criminal justice system. As he grew older, substance misuse became another significant factor in his life. Reports indicate that he developed problems with alcohol and illegal drugs, both of which further complicated an already unstable lifestyle. Over time, periods of imprisonment became increasingly common. Rather than establishing lasting stability after release, he frequently returned to offending, creating a cycle that proved difficult to break. Researchers who study persistent violent offenders often emphasize that there is rarely a single cause behind serious criminal behavior. Instead, multiple risk factors may interact over many years. In Hobson's case, commentators have pointed to childhood abuse, substance misuse, repeated offending, unstable relationships, and long-term involvement with the criminal justice system as factors that formed part of his personal history. None of these factors, however, can predict with certainty that an individual will become a killer, nor do they diminish personal responsibility for deliberate criminal acts. By the early 2000s, Hobson had spent much of his adult life moving between prison and the community. His criminal record was well established, and he remained known to law enforcement. Yet despite years of offending, the events that would unfold in 2004 and 2005 represented a dramatic escalation beyond his previous convictions. Looking back after the murders, investigators and commentators examined his earlier life for warning signs that might have indicated an increasing risk of serious violence. While certain patterns were identified in hindsight, criminal behavior does not always follow a predictable path. The transition from persistent offending to multiple murders is uncommon, even among individuals with lengthy criminal histories. Understanding that distinction is essential to understanding this case. The purpose of examining Hobson's background is not to create sympathy for the offender, but to provide context for how investigators, psychologists, and the courts later assessed his history. Ultimately, the evidence presented during his trial demonstrated that, regardless of his upbringing, he was legally responsible for the deliberate choices that resulted in the deaths of 5 people. As the years passed, one relationship continued to cast a long shadow over Hobson's life: his relationship with his stepfather, David Oakes. According to evidence presented after his arrest, Hobson continued to hold Oakes responsible for much of the suffering he believed had defined his childhood. Whether justified or not, that resentment remained with him for decades, growing rather than fading. When Hobson was released from prison in early 2004, he returned to society carrying not only a lengthy criminal record but also unresolved anger that had endured since childhood. Within months, that anger would become the starting point of a tragic chain of events that would ultimately claim 5 lives, launch a nationwide manhunt, and leave a lasting impact on communities across Yorkshire. By the early 2000s, Mark Hobson had become a familiar figure within the criminal justice system. Public records and later court proceedings showed a history of repeated offending that extended back many years. His convictions included property-related crimes and other offences that resulted in multiple periods of imprisonment. Rather than marking isolated mistakes, these convictions reflected a long-standing pattern of criminal behaviour that continued into adulthood. Each release from prison represented an opportunity to rebuild a more stable life, yet those opportunities proved difficult to sustain. Reports presented after his arrest described an individual who struggled with unstable housing, substance misuse, and maintaining lawful employment. These challenges were significant, but they were not unique. Many former prisoners face similar obstacles without resorting to serious violence. Investigators and the courts therefore treated these circumstances as background factors rather than explanations for the murders that would later occur. A recurring theme in accounts of Hobson's life was his continuing resentment toward his stepfather, David Oakes. Family members and reports presented during the legal proceedings suggested that Hobson believed Oakes was responsible for much of the abuse and instability he experienced while growing up. According to those accounts, this resentment did not diminish with time. Instead, it remained part of his thinking for many years. From a criminological perspective, long-term grievances can become deeply embedded in an individual's worldview. However, researchers consistently emphasize that holding a grievance does not inevitably lead to violent offending. Most people who experience abuse, neglect, or family conflict never commit homicide. In Hobson's case, the courts concluded that his later actions were the result of deliberate choices for which he bore full legal responsibility. When Hobson was released from prison in early 2004, he returned to the community after another period of incarceration. At that point, there was no public indication that he would soon become the focus of a nationwide murder investigation. He was one of many former offenders attempting to re-enter society after serving a sentence. What followed, however, marked a dramatic and tragic escalation. The first homicide for which Hobson was later convicted involved his stepfather, David Oakes. According to evidence presented at trial, the killing occurred in July 2004 following a confrontation between the two men. The prosecution argued that the attack reflected years of unresolved resentment. After the incident, Hobson left the scene and did not surrender to authorities. The death of David Oakes immediately became a serious homicide investigation. Detectives began gathering forensic evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing Hobson's recent movements. As evidence increasingly pointed toward him, police issued a nationwide appeal to locate and arrest him. From that moment onward, Hobson became a fugitive. Living outside the law placed him in an increasingly unstable situation. Evidence presented during the investigation indicated that he moved between remote locations, abandoned buildings, wooded areas, and temporary shelters while attempting to avoid capture. Investigators later determined that he obtained food, clothing, and other necessities through burglary and theft. The search for Hobson gradually expanded beyond a routine manhunt. Police forces across northern England shared intelligence, distributed his photograph, and encouraged members of the public to report any sightings immediately. Officers understood that locating him quickly was essential, both to enforce the outstanding warrant and to reduce the risk of further offending. At the time, however, investigators could not yet know the full extent of the danger. As additional deaths occurred during the following months, detectives began examining whether the incidents might be connected. Initially, each homicide was investigated on its own facts, with separate forensic examinations and witness interviews. As more evidence became available, similarities in location, timing, and circumstances prompted investigators to consider the possibility that a single offender was responsible. This marked a turning point in the investigation. The focus shifted from locating a fugitive wanted for one homicide to identifying and stopping an individual who might be responsible for multiple killings. The implications were profound. Rural communities across North and West Yorkshire, where many residents had long regarded violent crime as uncommon, found themselves confronted with growing uncertainty. Police increased patrols, appealed for information, and advised the public to remain vigilant while avoiding unnecessary risks. For investigators, every reported sighting became significant. Search teams examined remote areas, followed up on intelligence from members of the public, and coordinated efforts across multiple jurisdictions. Although many leads ultimately proved unsuccessful, the investigation steadily built a clearer picture of Hobson's movements during the months he remained at large. Looking back after the case concluded, investigators emphasized that the eventual outcome depended on persistent police work, forensic science, and cooperation from the public rather than any single breakthrough. The evidence gathered during this period would later form an important part of the prosecution's case. By early 2005, what had begun as a search for one wanted suspect had evolved into one of the most significant criminal investigations in Yorkshire in recent years. Police now faced the urgent challenge of locating Hobson before further lives were placed at risk, while communities waited anxiously for answers that had yet to come. The next stage of the investigation would reveal the full scale of the tragedy and ultimately lead to one of the most extensive manhunts in modern British policing. When major criminal cases become part of public memory, the names most people remember are often those of the offenders. Newspaper archives, documentaries, and television reports frequently place the perpetrator at the center of the narrative, while the people whose lives were taken become brief descriptions in a timeline of events. One of the most important responsibilities of any documentary examination of this case is to reverse that perspective. Before they became victims, they were individuals with routines, relationships, and plans for the future. Their identities should never be defined solely by the circumstances of their deaths. The first victim in the chain of events for which Mark Hobson was later convicted was his stepfather, David Oakes. Public reporting and court proceedings established that the relationship between the two men had been deeply troubled for many years. Accounts from family members described a history of conflict that stretched back to Hobson's childhood. During the later legal proceedings, allegations of long-term abuse within the family formed part of the background presented to the court. Those allegations were considered in understanding Hobson's personal history, but they did not alter the court's conclusion that he was legally responsible for the murder. Like many people whose names become associated with criminal cases, David Oakes was known very differently by those who had met him outside the courtroom. He was a member of a family whose private relationships were complex and whose life became permanently linked to one of Britain's most widely reported murder investigations. The circumstances surrounding his death would become the starting point of a much larger police operation that no one could yet foresee. After David Oakes' death, the investigation initially focused on locating a suspect wanted in connection with a single homicide. Neither investigators nor the wider public realized that the search would eventually expand into one of the most significant manhunts in Yorkshire during that period. The remaining victims shared no obvious connection with one another beyond the tragic fact that their paths crossed with a fugitive attempting to avoid capture. Among them were older members of rural communities who had spent much of their lives in the Yorkshire countryside. Public reports described individuals who had built quiet lives in areas where neighbors often knew one another and where violent crime was relatively uncommon. Many residents had lived in the same villages for decades, creating communities built on familiarity and mutual trust. For families living in those areas, daily routines often changed very little from season to season. Morning walks, visits to local shops, time spent tending gardens or small farms, and conversations with neighbors formed part of ordinary life. Such routines rarely attracted attention because they reflected the predictable rhythm of rural communities. That sense of predictability would be profoundly disrupted. As additional deaths occurred, Each affected family entered an experience shared by many relatives of homicide victims. Initial concern when a loved one failed to return home was followed by uncertainty, contact with police, and eventually devastating confirmation that would alter the course of their lives forever. In the aftermath of serious crimes, families are often required to navigate an overwhelming series of events. They may be asked to assist investigators, identify personal belongings, provide background information, and cope with intense media attention at the very moment they are trying to process profound grief. These practical realities rarely receive the same public attention as the criminal investigation itself, yet they represent an important part of the human impact of homicide. The communities affected by the Hobson investigation also experienced significant change. As police appeals increased and news coverage expanded, ordinary activities that had once seemed routine became sources of anxiety. Residents reported being more cautious about locking doors, checking on elderly relatives, and paying closer attention to unfamiliar visitors. Although rural Yorkshire remained fundamentally the same landscape, perceptions of personal safety had changed. For investigators, it was essential that each victim be understood not merely as part of a pattern but as an individual case requiring careful examination. Every scene was documented independently. Every witness was interviewed on the specific circumstances surrounding that victim. Every forensic examination sought to reconstruct events based on evidence rather than assumption. This methodical approach ultimately enabled detectives to identify similarities between the cases while ensuring that the evidence relating to each victim could withstand scrutiny in court. During the subsequent trial, prosecutors presented evidence linking Hobson to the deaths through forensic findings, witness testimony, and other investigative material. Although the legal process necessarily focused on establishing criminal responsibility, the proceedings also served another purpose: formally recognizing the lives that had been lost and ensuring that each victim's case was considered individually. In many homicide investigations, public attention fades after the conviction. For families, however, the consequences continue long after court proceedings conclude. Anniversaries, birthdays, and family gatherings become lasting reminders of someone whose place can never truly be filled. Researchers who study the impact of violent crime consistently note that bereavement following homicide often differs from other forms of loss because it is accompanied by prolonged legal proceedings, extensive media coverage, and continuing public interest. The Mark Hobson case illustrates this reality clearly. While the offender received widespread attention because of the nationwide manhunt and subsequent trial, the lasting effects were carried primarily by the families and communities left behind. Remembering that distinction is essential when examining any major criminal case. Justice seeks to establish responsibility and impose an appropriate sentence. It cannot restore the lives that were lost. As investigators continued to reconstruct Hobson's movements after the death of David Oakes, new evidence began to emerge from separate inquiries across Yorkshire. Initially appearing unrelated, these investigations would gradually reveal connections that transformed the understanding of the case. What had seemed to be isolated incidents would soon become part of a much broader inquiry, leading detectives to conclude that they were not searching for a suspect in a single homicide but for a fugitive who posed an ongoing threat to public safety. That realization marked the beginning of the next phase of one of the most complex murder investigations undertaken in Yorkshire during the mid-2000s. As the investigation widened, detectives came to understand that the case was no longer defined by a single victim or a single family. Each confirmed death represented a separate tragedy, but together they revealed something even more significant. Entire communities across Yorkshire had been affected by a sequence of events that few had imagined could happen in such familiar surroundings. The victims were not connected through occupation, social circles, or personal relationships. They did not belong to a common organization, nor were they selected because of a shared background. What linked them was circumstance. According to the evidence presented at trial, they encountered a man who was actively avoiding capture and whose decisions became increasingly dangerous as the search for him intensified. For investigators, understanding each victim's final known movements became essential. Detectives worked methodically to establish timelines, interview relatives and neighbors, and reconstruct ordinary routines. Such work serves two purposes in homicide investigations. It helps identify possible suspects, and equally important, it restores the individuality of those whose lives have been reduced in public discussion to little more than names in a criminal case. Family members described ordinary people leading ordinary lives. They spoke of routines that had remained largely unchanged for years, of familiar habits that reflected stability rather than excitement. Those personal recollections rarely become the focus of national news coverage, yet they often form the emotional foundation of a criminal investigation. Detectives seek to understand not only how a person died but also how they lived, because those details frequently help distinguish meaningful evidence from coincidence. As news of the investigation spread, communities throughout North and West Yorkshire began to respond in practical ways. Local residents checked on elderly neighbours more frequently. Families encouraged relatives living alone to remain in regular contact. Community members reported unfamiliar vehicles or suspicious activity to police more readily than before. These changes reflected caution rather than panic, but they also illustrated how a serious criminal investigation can alter everyday behavior even among people who are not directly connected to the victims. The police response expanded accordingly. Information gathered from one investigation was compared against evidence from others. Forensic laboratories examined recovered materials, while detectives reviewed witness statements for recurring details that might indicate a common offender. Such comparisons require patience and precision. Similarities between cases must be supported by evidence rather than assumption, and investigators remain careful not to force unrelated events into a single theory without sufficient proof. Over time, that careful approach began to reveal meaningful connections. The geographical distribution of the crimes, the timing of events, and the evidence recovered from multiple locations gradually strengthened investigators' belief that the same individual could be responsible. This conclusion was not reached after a single discovery but emerged through the accumulation of many independent findings examined together. For the families of the victims, however, these investigative developments could not lessen the reality of their loss. While the public followed police appeals and media reports, relatives faced the private consequences of violent crime. They attended funerals, supported one another through legal proceedings, and waited for answers that often came only after months of investigation. Many families of homicide victims describe this period as one of prolonged uncertainty, where grief is accompanied by repeated requests from investigators, legal representatives, and journalists. Researchers who study the effects of homicide on families consistently note that the impact extends far beyond the criminal trial itself. Court proceedings may establish legal responsibility, but they cannot restore relationships, shared experiences, or future plans that were permanently interrupted. In that sense, every homicide investigation has two parallel stories: the search for justice conducted by the authorities and the lifelong process of adjustment experienced by those left behind. This distinction remained evident throughout the Hobson investigation. Police focused on identifying, locating, and prosecuting the offender. Families focused on remembering the people they had lost. Both efforts were important, but they served very different purposes. The growing public attention surrounding the case also presented challenges. National media coverage brought awareness to the investigation and encouraged members of the public to provide information. At the same time, it placed additional pressure on investigators to communicate carefully and avoid releasing details that might compromise future court proceedings. Maintaining this balance is a common challenge in major criminal investigations, particularly when public concern is high and the suspect remains at large. By the beginning of 2005, detectives had assembled an increasingly detailed understanding of the suspect's movements. Information from witnesses, forensic examinations, and police intelligence was gradually narrowing the search. Although the investigation still faced considerable uncertainty, investigators now believed they were pursuing a single individual whose actions had affected multiple communities across Yorkshire. Looking back after the trial, many senior officers emphasized that the success of the investigation depended not on one dramatic breakthrough but on persistent, coordinated police work. Every witness interview, forensic examination, and public appeal contributed another piece to the overall picture. Step by step, investigators reduced uncertainty until the evidence formed a coherent account that could be presented before a jury. The victims' stories therefore remain central to understanding the case. Their lives remind us that homicide investigations are not simply exercises in criminal detection. They are efforts to establish the truth on behalf of people who can no longer speak for themselves. In the months ahead, that search for truth would intensify as investigators followed new leads, expanded the manhunt, and brought together the evidence that ultimately led to Mark Hobson's arrest and conviction. By the time investigators had begun to identify links between the separate homicide investigations, the case had grown beyond a series of individual crimes. It had become a test of how the criminal justice system responds when violence affects multiple communities over a relatively short period. While police concentrated on gathering evidence and locating the suspect, families faced a very different reality, one measured not by investigative milestones but by personal loss. One of the most significant lessons from this case is that every victim leaves behind a network of people whose lives are also changed. Parents lose children. Children lose parents. Friends lose lifelong companions. Neighbors lose familiar faces who had been part of daily life for years. Although court proceedings focus on legal responsibility, the broader consequences of homicide continue long after a verdict is delivered. During major investigations, police family liaison officers play an essential role. Their responsibilities extend beyond providing updates on the progress of the investigation. They help families understand legal procedures, explain forensic processes, coordinate communication with investigators, and offer support during what is often an overwhelming period. In complex homicide cases such as this one, those relationships can continue for many months while evidence is collected and prepared for court. The Mark Hobson investigation also demonstrated the importance of cooperation between different specialist units. Crime scene investigators documented physical evidence, forensic scientists examined biological and trace material, intelligence analysts compared information from multiple incidents, and detectives coordinated witness interviews across different locations. Modern homicide investigations depend on this multidisciplinary approach, particularly when investigators believe several offenses may be connected. At the same time, the media played an important but carefully managed role. Public appeals encouraged witnesses to come forward and increased awareness that a dangerous fugitive remained at large. Investigators, however, were careful not to disclose information that could compromise the inquiry or prejudice future court proceedings. This balance between transparency and protecting the integrity of an investigation is a recurring challenge in high-profile criminal cases. As the inquiry progressed, public confidence increasingly depended on visible police activity. Additional patrols, regular appeals for information, and coordinated searches reassured communities that significant resources were being devoted to locating the suspect. Although residents understandably experienced concern, investigators consistently encouraged vigilance rather than panic, emphasizing the importance of reporting credible information while avoiding speculation. The case also prompted broader discussion among criminologists and mental health professionals after the trial concluded. Researchers examined whether earlier intervention, better support for vulnerable children, or improved management of repeat offenders might reduce the risk of similar cases in the future. These discussions did not suggest that any single intervention would necessarily have changed the outcome. Instead, they highlighted the value of continually improving systems designed to identify risk, support rehabilitation, and protect the public. Another important lesson concerns the distinction between understanding and excusing criminal behavior. Throughout the legal proceedings, Hobson's difficult childhood and personal history were examined in detail. The court accepted that aspects of his upbringing had been deeply troubled. At the same time, the evidence demonstrated that he knowingly committed the offenses for which he was convicted. The sentence reflected the court's conclusion that he remained fully responsible for those deliberate actions. This distinction remains central to contemporary criminology. Examining an offender's background can improve understanding of risk factors and inform future prevention strategies. It should never diminish recognition of the victims or reduce accountability for criminal conduct. For the affected communities, the end of the investigation did not erase the memories of those events. Serious crimes often leave lasting effects on how people view personal safety and community life. Over time, confidence gradually returns, but many residents continue to remember where they were when the investigation dominated local news and when police appeals became part of everyday conversation. Today, the Mark Hobson case is studied primarily for three reasons. First, it illustrates how determined investigative work, supported by forensic evidence and public cooperation, can successfully resolve a complex series of offenses. Second, it demonstrates the importance of treating each victim as an individual rather than merely one element of a larger case. Third, it reinforces a principle that extends beyond this investigation. Difficult life experiences may help explain aspects of a person's history, but they do not remove personal responsibility for deliberate acts of violence. As this documentary moves into the next chapter, the focus shifts from the lives affected by the crimes to the investigation itself. Detectives would soon face the challenge of reconstructing events across multiple locations, evaluating forensic evidence, and determining whether seemingly separate incidents formed part of a single pattern. Those efforts would ultimately become the foundation of the prosecution's case and lead to one of the most significant manhunts in Yorkshire during that period. The investigation that would eventually lead to Mark Hobson's conviction did not begin with the expectation that police were confronting a series of connected murders. Like many homicide inquiries, it started with a single victim, a protected crime scene, and a team of investigators tasked with establishing exactly what had happened through evidence rather than assumption. Following the death of David Oakes in July 2004, officers secured the location and initiated the standard procedures used in major homicide investigations in England and Wales. Crime scene investigators documented the area in detail before any physical evidence was removed. Every stage of the examination was carefully recorded to preserve the integrity of the evidence for potential court proceedings. Establishing an accurate record of the scene is a fundamental principle of forensic investigation because it allows later findings to be interpreted within their original context. Detectives simultaneously began reconstructing the victim's recent activities. Investigators interviewed relatives, neighbors, and other individuals who had been in contact with David Oakes during the days leading up to his death. These interviews sought to establish a reliable timeline, identify recent visitors, and determine whether there had been any unusual activity before the incident. At this stage, investigators considered multiple possibilities while remaining guided by the available evidence. As witness accounts and forensic findings accumulated, attention increasingly focused on Mark Hobson. His relationship with the victim, together with other information obtained during the inquiry, led investigators to identify him as the principal suspect. Police therefore issued appeals requesting information about his whereabouts and began coordinating efforts across different jurisdictions to locate him. Once a homicide suspect leaves the immediate area, investigations become significantly more complex. Detectives must determine not only where the suspect may have traveled but also whether they have access to vehicles, financial resources, acquaintances willing to provide assistance, or locations where they might seek temporary shelter. Intelligence officers reviewed available information to identify places associated with Hobson's previous movements and known contacts. Public assistance became an important part of the investigation. Police distributed photographs of Hobson and encouraged anyone with credible information to contact the authorities immediately rather than approach him directly. Such appeals are common in major investigations involving potentially dangerous suspects, as they increase the likelihood of generating useful intelligence while minimizing unnecessary risks to members of the public. Over the following months, officers received numerous reports from across northern England. Each report required careful assessment. Some contained information that could be verified and followed up by investigators. Others were eliminated after routine inquiries. Evaluating these reports demanded considerable resources, but detectives understood that even a seemingly minor observation might prove significant when combined with other evidence. Meanwhile, investigators continued examining forensic material recovered during the original inquiry. Modern homicide investigations rely on the integration of multiple forms of evidence, including biological samples, fingerprints, footwear impressions, and trace materials. Each category of evidence is evaluated independently before being considered alongside witness testimony and other investigative findings. This layered approach reduces the likelihood that conclusions will depend upon a single source of information. As additional serious incidents occurred in Yorkshire during the following months, detectives initially investigated each one independently. Separate teams documented each location, interviewed witnesses, and collected forensic evidence according to established procedures. Only after careful comparison did investigators begin considering whether similarities between the cases justified exploring the possibility of a common offender. This process illustrates an important feature of professional criminal investigation. Detectives do not begin with a conclusion and then search for supporting evidence. Instead, they examine the available evidence first and allow patterns to emerge through systematic analysis. In this case, the accumulation of information from multiple inquiries gradually suggested that the incidents might be linked. Senior investigators therefore increased coordination between police units working on the separate cases. Information was shared more extensively, timelines were compared, and analysts examined whether movements associated with the suspect were consistent with the developing evidence. This collaborative approach enabled investigators to view the inquiry from a broader perspective rather than as a series of isolated events. As confidence grew that the investigations were connected, operational priorities also changed. Locating Hobson became increasingly urgent, not only to answer outstanding questions relating to previous offenses but also to reduce the risk of further harm. Additional personnel were assigned to the inquiry, specialist resources were deployed, and cooperation between regional police forces intensified. Throughout this period, investigators remained mindful that successful prosecutions depend on evidence capable of withstanding detailed scrutiny in court. Every witness statement required verification where possible. Every forensic finding had to be properly documented and interpreted. Every investigative decision had to be recorded. These standards are essential because major criminal trials often involve extensive examination of the methods used to collect and preserve evidence. Looking back after the conclusion of the case, senior officers emphasized that the investigation progressed through persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Individual pieces of evidence that appeared limited when viewed alone became far more significant when combined with witness testimony, forensic analysis, and intelligence gathered over many months. It was this cumulative process that gradually transformed a homicide inquiry into one of Yorkshire's most significant coordinated criminal investigations. By early 2005, investigators had assembled a growing body of evidence, but one critical objective remained unresolved: locating the suspect. Until Hobson was found, detectives could not fully account for his movements, verify outstanding lines of inquiry, or bring the case before the courts. The next phase of the investigation would therefore focus on one of the largest coordinated search efforts undertaken in the region during that period, bringing together officers, specialist search teams, forensic experts, and members of the public in an effort to end the investigation through lawful arrest rather than continued uncertainty. As the search for Mark Hobson continued, investigators increasingly recognized that they were dealing with a case extending beyond a single homicide inquiry. What had initially been approached as an individual investigation gradually evolved into a coordinated operation involving multiple police units, forensic specialists, intelligence analysts, and officers from different jurisdictions across northern England. One of the first priorities was establishing whether apparently separate incidents shared evidential links. In major investigations, detectives do not rely on instinct or coincidence alone. Instead, they compare objective information from each inquiry, including timelines, geographic locations, witness statements, forensic findings, and patterns of offending. Only when sufficient evidence supports a connection do investigators begin treating separate incidents as part of the same investigation. In the Hobson inquiry, this analytical process became increasingly important. Detectives carefully reviewed reports from different locations throughout Yorkshire, comparing each case against the growing body of evidence already collected. While every incident remained subject to its own forensic examination, Similarities identified through systematic review encouraged investigators to coordinate their efforts more closely. Forensic science played a central role throughout this stage of the investigation. Crime scene specialists examined biological evidence, fingerprints, footwear impressions, and trace materials recovered from multiple locations. Each item was documented according to established evidential procedures before being submitted for laboratory analysis. The value of forensic evidence often lies not in a single dramatic discovery but in its ability to corroborate or challenge information obtained through witness interviews and investigative intelligence. Witnesses also provided important contributions. Detectives interviewed individuals who had reported unusual activity, unfamiliar vehicles, or possible sightings of the suspect. Every statement was assessed individually and then compared with other information already available to investigators. Most reports required careful verification, and many ultimately proved unrelated. Even so, investigators understood that apparently minor observations can become significant when viewed alongside independent evidence gathered elsewhere. The geographical nature of the investigation presented considerable operational challenges. Many locations associated with the inquiry were rural, requiring search teams to cover extensive areas of woodland, farmland, and isolated properties. Such environments can complicate both evidence recovery and search operations, particularly during winter conditions. Specialist search officers, supported by trained police dogs and aerial resources where appropriate, were deployed to assist in locating evidence and following investigative leads. As the inquiry expanded, police also relied heavily on intelligence analysis. Modern homicide investigations generate substantial volumes of information, including witness reports, previous criminal records, vehicle sightings, telephone information obtained through lawful investigative processes, and other operational intelligence. Analysts examined these datasets to identify recurring patterns and assist detectives in prioritizing investigative activity. Public cooperation remained an important component of the operation. Police issued repeated appeals encouraging members of the public to report credible information while avoiding direct contact with the suspect. Such appeals are designed not only to increase the flow of information but also to protect public safety. Investigators emphasized that any potentially significant sighting should be communicated immediately through official channels so that trained officers could respond appropriately. Behind the scenes, the investigation required continuous coordination between numerous specialist teams. Senior investigating officers held regular operational meetings to review new evidence, allocate resources, and reassess investigative priorities. As additional information became available, lines of inquiry were either expanded or eliminated according to the evidential standard required for criminal investigations. Throughout this period, investigators remained mindful that every decision could later be examined during court proceedings. Maintaining a clear chain of custody for physical evidence, accurately documenting witness interviews, and recording investigative decisions were essential to ensuring that the prosecution could demonstrate both the reliability of the evidence and the integrity of the investigation. The inquiry also highlighted the importance of patience in major criminal investigations. Contrary to popular portrayals in fictional crime dramas, complex cases are rarely solved through a single decisive discovery. More often, investigators gradually assemble numerous independent pieces of evidence until they collectively establish a coherent and legally persuasive account of events. By early 2005, detectives had developed an increasingly comprehensive understanding of the investigation. Evidence from multiple sources suggested that the suspect had remained mobile while avoiding arrest, moving between different rural locations and relying on temporary shelter rather than maintaining a fixed residence. This assessment helped guide operational planning and informed decisions about where search resources should be concentrated. At the same time, investigators recognized that locating Hobson remained the most urgent objective. While forensic evidence and witness testimony continued to strengthen the developing case, the investigation could not be fully concluded until the suspect had been apprehended and formally interviewed in accordance with criminal procedure. Looking back after the trial, senior officers emphasized that the successful resolution of the case resulted from sustained cooperation across policing disciplines rather than any single investigative technique. Forensic science, witness evidence, intelligence analysis, public assistance, and coordinated operational planning each contributed to the eventual outcome. Together, they transformed a series of complex inquiries into a unified prosecution supported by multiple independent forms of evidence. As the search intensified, investigators believed they were steadily narrowing the range of possibilities. Reports from the public, forensic findings, and intelligence assessments increasingly pointed toward a fugitive whose opportunities to remain undetected were becoming more limited. The next phase of the investigation would focus on locating and arresting Hobson, bringing the operational search to an end and allowing the criminal justice process to move from investigation toward prosecution before the courts. By the time Mark Hobson was taken into custody in February 2005, investigators had already spent months assembling a complex body of evidence. Their objective was no longer limited to identifying a suspect. Instead, they now faced the equally important task of demonstrating, through reliable and independently verifiable evidence, how the offenses were connected and whether the available material satisfied the standard required for prosecution. In the British criminal justice system, a conviction for murder must be supported by evidence capable of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. This requires investigators to build a case using multiple independent sources rather than relying on a single piece of information. The Hobson investigation reflected that principle throughout. Following his arrest, officers secured Hobson's clothing and personal belongings under strict evidential procedures. Each item was individually packaged, labeled, and documented to preserve the chain of custody. Maintaining this chain is essential because it allows prosecutors to demonstrate that evidence presented in court has been properly handled from the moment it was collected until it is examined during trial. Forensic scientists then began comparing material recovered from Hobson with evidence collected from the various crime scenes. Biological traces, fingerprints, footwear impressions, and other physical evidence were examined independently before investigators considered how those findings fitted within the wider investigation. DNA analysis formed one important part of this process. By the early 2000s, DNA profiling had become an established investigative tool in the United Kingdom. Properly recovered biological material could be compared with reference samples obtained during the investigation, allowing scientists to determine whether a particular individual could be associated with specific evidence. In this case, forensic findings were presented alongside other forms of evidence rather than being treated as the sole basis for the prosecution. Footwear evidence also received careful attention. Crime scene investigators documented impressions where conditions allowed, recording their location, dimensions, and distinguishing characteristics. Footwear comparison cannot usually identify a specific person on its own, but it can demonstrate consistency between impressions found at different locations and shoes recovered during an investigation. When interpreted alongside additional evidence, such findings can significantly strengthen an overall case. Fingerprint examination provided another avenue of inquiry. Specialists compared any suitable impressions recovered during the investigation with known prints obtained through lawful police procedures. As with all forensic disciplines, fingerprint evidence is evaluated according to established scientific standards and considered alongside the broader evidential picture rather than in isolation. The investigation also benefited from detailed scene reconstruction. Crime scene managers coordinated the work of forensic specialists, photographers, and evidence recovery teams to ensure that each location was documented as completely as possible. Measurements, photographs, and diagrams enabled investigators to review the scenes repeatedly during the investigation and later explain their findings clearly in court. Forensic evidence alone, however, rarely tells the entire story. Detectives therefore combined scientific findings with witness testimony, intelligence reports, and information about Hobson's movements before and after the offenses. This process of corroboration is fundamental to major criminal investigations. Independent sources that support one another generally provide a far stronger evidential foundation than any single category of proof. Investigators also reviewed Hobson's activities while he remained a fugitive. Evidence concerning accommodation, travel, and property offenses helped detectives establish a timeline of his movements. Reconstructing these movements allowed investigators to compare his known locations with the timing of the offenses under investigation, further strengthening the chronological framework presented during the prosecution. Throughout the inquiry, forensic laboratories maintained detailed records of every examination performed. Each result was documented, reviewed, and disclosed in accordance with criminal procedure. Expert witnesses later explained their conclusions before the court, where their methods and findings were subject to examination by both the prosecution and the defense. This adversarial process helps ensure that scientific evidence is tested openly before a jury. The Hobson investigation illustrates an important principle of modern forensic science. Major cases are seldom solved by one decisive laboratory result alone. Instead, investigators gradually assemble numerous pieces of reliable evidence until they form a coherent account supported from multiple independent directions. DNA findings, fingerprint comparisons, footwear analysis, witness testimony, timelines, and other investigative material each contributed to the overall evidential picture. Senior investigators later noted that the strength of the prosecution case rested not on a single dramatic discovery but on the consistency of the evidence as a whole. Individual findings that might appear limited when viewed independently became considerably more persuasive when assessed together. This cumulative approach is characteristic of many successful homicide investigations and reflects the standards expected by British courts when considering offences of the utmost seriousness. By the conclusion of the forensic examination, detectives believed they had assembled sufficient evidence not only to identify Hobson as the offender but also to demonstrate the connections between the separate investigations. The focus of the case would soon shift from evidence collection to courtroom presentation, where prosecutors would explain how months of careful investigative work had produced a comprehensive body of evidence capable of supporting one of the most serious murder prosecutions in England during that period. The investigation into Mark Hobson illustrates how modern homicide inquiries are built through the accumulation of independent evidence rather than a single decisive discovery. Although Hobson ultimately became one of the United Kingdom's most wanted fugitives during the investigation, detectives approached the case using established investigative procedures designed to preserve evidence, test competing hypotheses, and ensure that any future prosecution would withstand judicial scrutiny. The inquiry began as a homicide investigation following the death of David Oakes in July 2004. As with all major crime scenes, officers first secured the location to prevent contamination. Crime scene investigators photographed and documented the scene before recovering physical evidence. Every item collected was recorded through a documented chain of custody, ensuring that its handling could later be verified during court proceedings. At the same time, detectives began constructing a victimology profile. This process focuses on understanding the victim's recent activities, relationships, daily routine, and known associates. Investigators interviewed relatives, neighbors, and other witnesses to establish a reliable timeline of David Oakes' final known movements. Rather than beginning with a predetermined suspect, investigators sought to identify everyone who had recent contact with the victim and compare those accounts against physical evidence. As the inquiry progressed, Mark Hobson quickly became a person of significant investigative interest. His known relationship with the victim, together with evidence gathered during the investigation, justified expanding efforts to locate him. Police circulated his description nationally and coordinated with other forces to identify possible sightings. Once Hobson could not be located, the investigation shifted from a conventional homicide inquiry to one involving a wanted fugitive. The inquiry became substantially more complex when additional killings occurred during the months that followed. Initially, each incident was investigated independently. Separate crime scenes were examined, forensic evidence was collected, and witness interviews were conducted without assuming that the cases were connected. This cautious approach reflects a fundamental principle of criminal investigation. Cases are linked only when supported by evidence rather than by superficial similarities. As forensic laboratories processed material from multiple investigations, detectives and analysts began comparing the available evidence. Biological traces, fingerprints, footwear impressions, witness statements, and intelligence reports were reviewed collectively. Analysts also examined the chronology and geographic distribution of the incidents to determine whether they were consistent with the movements of a single offender. The investigation relied heavily on multidisciplinary cooperation. Senior investigating officers coordinated detectives, forensic scientists, intelligence analysts, search specialists, and uniformed officers working across different police jurisdictions. Information sharing between these teams allowed investigators to compare evidence that might otherwise have remained isolated within separate inquiries. Public assistance also became an important investigative resource. Police appeals encouraged members of the public to report credible sightings of Hobson while emphasizing that he should not be approached. Every report was assessed according to its reliability and compared against existing intelligence. Although many sightings proved unrelated, the systematic evaluation of public information helped investigators narrow operational priorities. Search operations reflected the geographical challenges of rural Yorkshire. Officers conducted coordinated searches of wooded areas, isolated buildings, and other locations where a fugitive might seek temporary shelter. These operations were supported by specialist search teams, police dogs, and aerial resources when appropriate. Such deployments required significant logistical planning and coordination between local and regional policing units. Throughout the investigation, forensic science remained central to the evidential strategy. Physical evidence recovered from Hobson after his arrest was examined alongside material collected from multiple crime scenes. Scientists compared biological samples, footwear evidence, fingerprints, and other trace materials using established forensic methods. Importantly, these findings were interpreted alongside witness testimony and investigative intelligence rather than treated as isolated proof. Investigators also reconstructed Hobson's movements during the period in which he remained at large. By combining witness accounts, property offense investigations, forensic findings, and intelligence information, detectives established a timeline that assisted prosecutors in explaining the sequence of events before the court. This chronological reconstruction demonstrated how different strands of evidence reinforced one another. Following Hobson's arrest in February 2005, investigators entered the evidential review phase. Every statement, forensic report, exhibit, and investigative decision was evaluated before submission to the Crown Prosecution Service. Prosecutors then assessed whether the available evidence met the legal standard required to proceed with multiple murder charges. At trial, the prosecution presented a case based on the cumulative weight of independent evidence. Rather than relying upon a single forensic result or witness account, the case integrated scientific evidence, witness testimony, investigative timelines, and physical exhibits. The jury ultimately convicted Hobson, and the court concluded that he had acted deliberately and was fully responsible for his crimes. From an investigative perspective, the Hobson case demonstrates several enduring principles of homicide investigation. Crime scenes must be protected immediately. Evidence must be collected according to strict scientific standards. Independent lines of inquiry should be corroborated wherever possible. Investigative assumptions must be continually tested against objective evidence. Finally, successful prosecutions depend not upon dramatic breakthroughs but upon careful, methodical work carried out over many months by numerous specialists working together. Today, the case continues to be referenced in discussions of major crime investigation in England because it illustrates the importance of coordinated policing, forensic science, and disciplined evidential review. While public attention often focuses on the offender, the investigation itself serves as an example of how complex homicide inquiries are resolved through persistence, interagency cooperation, and adherence to established legal and forensic procedures. The successful prosecution of Mark Hobson was not based on a confession alone, nor on a single piece of physical evidence. Instead, it reflected the cumulative effect of multiple independent forensic disciplines working together. Investigators combined scientific examination with witness testimony, intelligence analysis, and traditional detective work to build a case that could withstand scrutiny before a jury. One of the first priorities after each crime scene was discovered was preservation. British police follow strict procedures to protect scenes from contamination. Officers establish a secure perimeter, restrict unnecessary access, and maintain detailed logs identifying everyone who enters or leaves the location. These measures help ensure that any evidence recovered can later be shown to have remained intact throughout the investigation. Crime scene investigators, CSIs, then conducted systematic examinations. Rather than searching randomly, they documented each location in a structured manner through photography, measurements, sketches, and written notes before collecting evidence. This process creates a permanent record that investigators, forensic scientists, and the courts can later review when reconstructing events. Biological evidence was one of the key forensic categories examined. Depending on the circumstances of a crime scene, investigators may recover blood, skin cells, hair, or other biological material suitable for DNA profiling. In the Hobson investigation, forensic scientists compared biological samples recovered during the inquiry with reference samples obtained through lawful investigative procedures. DNA evidence is particularly valuable because it can associate an individual with specific evidence, but investigators do not rely on DNA in isolation. Instead, it forms one component of a broader evidential picture. Fingerprint examination represented another important investigative tool. Specialists compared suitable latent fingerprints recovered during the investigation with known prints held through police records or obtained during the inquiry. Fingerprint identification is based on the unique ridge characteristics present on each individual's fingers. When sufficient corresponding detail exists, fingerprint evidence can provide strong support for other investigative findings. Footwear evidence also contributed to the case. Footwear impressions can reveal the type of shoe involved, approximate size, and sometimes distinctive wear patterns or damage. Investigators photographed and cast impressions where appropriate before comparing them with footwear recovered during the investigation. While footwear evidence rarely identifies a specific person on its own, it can demonstrate consistency between multiple locations and strengthen other forensic findings. Trace evidence formed another important category. Small materials such as fibers, soil particles, paint fragments, or plant material can sometimes establish associations between people, objects, and locations. Modern forensic laboratories use highly specialized analytical techniques to examine these materials. Although individual trace findings may appear limited, their evidential value often increases when considered alongside other independent evidence. Equally important was the maintenance of the chain of custody. Every exhibit recovered during the investigation was assigned a unique identifier, packaged appropriately, and documented whenever it changed hands. This record allows the court to verify that evidence presented during trial is the same evidence originally recovered and that it has not been altered or contaminated. The investigation also relied heavily on forensic pathology. A forensic pathologist examines the deceased to establish, where possible, the medical cause of death and identify findings relevant to the investigation. Pathologists work independently, providing scientific opinions based on medical examination rather than investigative assumptions. Their conclusions help detectives understand the sequence of events and guide subsequent lines of inquiry. Scientific evidence alone, however, does not solve complex homicide investigations. Detectives continually compared laboratory findings with witness interviews, intelligence reports, and reconstructed timelines. If forensic results conflicted with a witness account, investigators examined the discrepancy rather than ignoring it. This process of corroboration is fundamental to professional criminal investigation. The analytical phase of the Hobson investigation required close cooperation between multiple forensic disciplines. DNA specialists, fingerprint experts, footwear analysts, forensic pathologists, crime scene managers, and detectives each examined different aspects of the evidence. Senior investigators then integrated these independent findings into a comprehensive evidential framework suitable for presentation in court. When the case reached trial, forensic experts appeared as independent witnesses rather than advocates for either side. Their responsibility was to explain the methods used, the limitations of their analyses, and the conclusions supported by the evidence. Defense counsel had the opportunity to question both methodology and interpretation, reflecting the adversarial nature of the British legal system. This process helps ensure that scientific evidence is evaluated transparently before the jury. One of the most significant lessons from the Hobson investigation is that forensic science is most effective when combined with careful detective work. Television dramas often portray laboratory evidence as producing immediate answers. In reality, successful investigations depend on the gradual accumulation of reliable information from many different sources. Laboratory findings, witness testimony, search operations, intelligence analysis, and investigative interviews each contribute different pieces of the overall picture. The case also illustrates the importance of forensic restraint. Investigators did not draw conclusions based solely on one category of evidence. Instead, they sought consistency across independent sources before advancing a particular theory. This approach reduces the risk of error and strengthens the reliability of the prosecution's case. Looking back, the Hobson investigation stands as an example of how modern forensic practice supports the criminal justice system. Scientific examination did not replace traditional investigative methods, it enhanced them. By integrating forensic evidence with meticulous detective work and rigorous legal procedure, investigators were able to present a comprehensive evidential case that ultimately supported the convictions returned by the jury. Following Mark Hobson's arrest and the completion of the police investigation, the case entered the next phase of the criminal justice process, prosecution before the Crown Court. By this stage, detectives had assembled a substantial body of evidence from forensic examinations, witness interviews, investigative timelines, and physical exhibits. The role of the court was not to repeat the investigation, but to determine whether the prosecution had proved the charges beyond reasonable doubt according to English criminal law. Before the trial began, prosecutors from the Crown Prosecution Service conducted a detailed review of the evidence gathered by police. This review assesses whether there is a realistic prospect of conviction and whether prosecution is in the public interest. Given the seriousness of the offences and the strength of the available evidence, the case proceeded to trial. Throughout the proceedings, the prosecution sought to demonstrate that the murders were deliberate acts committed by Hobson and that the available evidence linked him to each offence. Rather than depending upon one decisive piece of evidence, prosecutors presented a cumulative case. They argued that forensic findings, witness testimony, recovered exhibits, and the reconstruction of Hobson's movements consistently pointed toward his responsibility. Expert witnesses formed an important part of the prosecution's presentation. Forensic scientists explained the scientific methods used to examine physical evidence and the conclusions supported by laboratory analysis. Crime scene specialists described how evidence had been recovered and preserved. Investigating officers outlined the chronology of the inquiry and explained how separate lines of evidence gradually converged during the investigation. Witness testimony also contributed to the evidential picture. Individuals who had information relevant to Hobson's movements or the investigation were called to give evidence under oath. As in all criminal trials, their testimony was subject to questioning by both the prosecution and the defense. The adversarial process allows each side to test the reliability, consistency, and significance of the evidence before the jury. The defense focused attention on Hobson's personal history, including reports of childhood abuse, long-standing behavioral difficulties, substance misuse, and mental health concerns. These matters were presented to provide context for his background and personal circumstances. However, the central legal question before the court was not whether Hobson had experienced hardship, but whether he was criminally responsible for the offences charged. English criminal law recognizes that evidence relating to an offender's background may be relevant in certain contexts, particularly during sentencing. It does not, by itself, remove criminal responsibility where the evidence demonstrates that the accused understood the nature of their actions and acted voluntarily. After considering the evidence, the court concluded that Hobson's actions had been intentional and that he remained legally responsible for the murders. The prosecution argued successfully that the offences demonstrated planning, repeated offending over time, and conduct intended to avoid detection. These findings were significant because they distinguished the case from one involving diminished responsibility or other partial defences. The jury ultimately returned verdicts finding Hobson guilty of murder. Those verdicts reflected their assessment that the prosecution had established guilt beyond reasonable doubt based upon the totality of the evidence presented during the trial. Following conviction, the proceedings moved to sentencing. In England and Wales, murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment. The remaining question for the court is the minimum term or, in the most serious cases, whether a whole life order should be imposed. A whole life order is the most severe sentence available under English law. It means that the offender is sentenced to life imprisonment without a minimum term after which they would normally become eligible for parole consideration. While exceptional legal mechanisms exist in very limited circumstances, a whole life order is intended for offenders whose crimes are considered so exceptionally serious that lifelong imprisonment is regarded as the appropriate sentence. When determining sentence, judges consider statutory sentencing principles together with aggravating and mitigating factors. Aggravating factors can include multiple murders, repeated violent offending, or conduct demonstrating an exceptional danger to the public. Mitigating factors may include aspects of the offender's background or personal circumstances where they are supported by evidence. In Hobson's case, the court accepted that his upbringing had been deeply troubled and that he had experienced significant personal difficulties earlier in life. Nevertheless, the judge concluded that these circumstances did not outweigh the seriousness of the offenses or diminish his legal responsibility. The court found that the murders reflected deliberate decisions made over an extended period and demonstrated an ongoing threat to public safety. The sentencing remarks emphasized the protection of the public as one of the central objectives of the criminal justice system. Courts impose sentences not only to punish unlawful conduct but also to recognize the harm caused to victims, maintain public confidence in the administration of justice, and, where necessary, protect society from individuals assessed as presenting an exceptional continuing risk. The whole life order imposed on Hobson reflected that assessment. The sentence indicated the court's conclusion that the gravity of the offenses placed them among the most serious categories of murder recognized under English law. Beyond its legal significance, the trial also provided a formal opportunity for the evidence gathered over many months to be examined in open court. Investigative decisions, forensic findings, and witness testimony were subjected to detailed scrutiny before an independent judge and jury. This transparency remains a defining feature of the criminal justice process, ensuring that serious convictions are based upon evidence tested through established legal procedures. The conclusion of the trial marked the end of the criminal proceedings, but it did not end the consequences of the case. For the families of those who had been killed, the verdict brought legal resolution without removing the lasting effects of their loss. For investigators, it represented the culmination of months of coordinated work involving police officers, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and many members of the public who had assisted the inquiry. Today, the Hobson case continues to be referenced within discussions of homicide investigation and criminal justice because it illustrates the interaction between forensic science, coordinated policing, and judicial oversight. It also reinforces a broader principle that remains central to both criminology and law. Understanding the factors that contribute to offending is important for prevention and research, but those factors do not replace personal accountability when deliberate criminal acts are committed.